Popular monitoring utility HWINFO64 has jolted life into a new discussion on AMD Ryzen parts, specifically talking about power consumption, motherboard manufacturers' cheating results, as we've discussed about before, and CPUs allegedly burning out on the AM4 platform. In this content today, we're going to be looking into the new metric that's entitled Power Reporting Deviation in HWINFO, and we'll be addressing three key points. Number one, we'll be talking about HWINFO's new feature and explaining how it works and what it does and what it's actually showing you. Two, we'll be talking about the headlining fear of burnouts, as it's been reported, of AMD CPUs, as discussed by another outlet, and our general disagreement with the premise of that. And then three, we'll be exploring the testing data we've collected in a set of benchmarks looking at this new metric in HWINFO on a couple of different motherboards, including one specifically that does deviate quite far from baseline. So this will help show you which boards are juicing up AMD CPUs to try and score higher in benchmarks. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Corsair Dark Core RGB Pro wireless mouse, which claims sub 1 millisecond wireless response, low latency Bluetooth, an 18,000 dpi sensor, a 2000 Hz polling rate, and interchangeable side grips. Corsair's mouse can charge on the MM1000 mousepad with Qi charging, or it can be used wired. Learn more at the link in the description below. This piece is really interesting because in the process of researching for this piece, one of the things that we discovered was that an initial reviewer BIOS launched with a particular motherboard had a significantly higher power budget afforded to the CPU by tricking the CPU into thinking it's drawing less power than it is. All of this stems from the ideas posed by The Stilt in his post on HWINFO's forums, and we've just sort of explored it a bit more with our own approach to testing. So it's interesting because in reference to that one particular motherboard, you end up with a scenario where the later released publicly available versions of BIOS that you all would use if you bought the product are actually significantly lower in power budget than the reviewer release was. And that poses a problem. But because we test with the settings from the manufacturer, that'd be AMD or Intel, manually enforced, and we make sure that we follow the official guidance from AMD or Intel and don't let the motherboards do whatever we want, it doesn't really affect our test results, but it has potential to affect test results or to mislead consumers or similar things like that. I mean, it's like that MCE discussion all over again, except with AMD this time. So we'll start with an explainer of what's going on and how all of this relates to HWINFO's new line item, which is the Power Reporting Deviation item. That is measured in a percentage against a 100% baseline. So if you have a Ryzen system, you install HWINFO, you can scroll down with the new beta version of the software, and you'll see things like CPU package power, and then you'll also see this new power deviation item. And that will be represented as 100% if it's under, for example, a full all-core load, and it's running at the expected power budget. Whereas if you see something like 50% or 120%, there's a deviation that is maybe undesirable or could just be error, which we'll talk about both of those here today. This whole topic looks at a similar concept to shunt resistor mods on GPUs. If you've seen our content on that, it's the same basic idea, except instead of modifying a shunt resistor or physically modifying a board, this is all happening through software, through BIOS, on the motherboard manufacturer side of things. But ultimately, it's the same concept where with a shunt resistor mod, you're tricking something like a Titan RTX to think that it's drawing maybe 180 watts instead of 250 watts. And by tricking it to that degree, you then effectively have additional power budget that you can spend on increasing the performance of the part, because you're no longer hitting, as far as the GPU is concerned, the power restrictions that have been imposed by vBIOS by the manufacturer. It's the same type of concept here, just a little bit different execution. This also means that anyone using the CPU package power metric to report CPU power consumption would be exposed to potentially bad data. We take our CPU power measurements using hardware, and we can pop some of those charts up on the screen from our recent CPU reviews. These measure directly at the EPS 12 volt cables for our testing. So fortunately, the issues that have been posed by The Stilt and HWINFO do not affect us, and it's a good reminder as to why we never really trust logging software to begin with, something we discussed at length in our CPU methods video. Any data using total system power measurements, EPS 12 volt cable measurements, or HWINFO readings of boards that don't cheat will remain accurate, but those that do cheat the results, it'll actually be underreported potentially versus reality. As we recently reported yet again with Z490's launch, manufacturers of Intel motherboards have a habit of playing fast and loose with turbo guidelines to give themselves an edge in benchmarks. According to an explanation of HWiNFO's new metric by technical analyst The Stilt, a related issue occurs with AMD boards. The Stilt's post starts off by explaining that for AM4 Ryzen CPUs, quote, the voltage, current, and power telemetry is provided to the processor by the motherboard VRM controller through the AMD SVI2 interface. The CPU uses the numbers passed to it by the motherboard to keep itself within the socket AM4 power limits. That'd be PPT, TDC, and EDC. The VRM controller represents electrical current to the CPU as an integer between 0 and 255, but this integer isn't literally a number of amps. To convert it to the real current measurement, the CPU multiplies this number by a static reference number that's supplied by the motherboard. This number must be calculated for each motherboard model by the manufacturer and baked into firmware. The number is referred to as the telemetry reference current. The problem is that motherboard manufacturers can define this telemetry reference current as whatever they want, and the CPU has to take that number at face value. So, in the unlikely event, as an example, that a manufacturer sets the value too high, the CPU will actually think that it's drawing more power than it actually is. And in that instance, what happens is potentially a downclock or something to conform with the PPT limit. And you can read our earlier piece or watch it on Precision Boost Overdrive versus PB2 and how those work if you want more information and a better understanding of the various limits like PBT and EDC for AMD Ryzen processors. We'll link that below if you want more on that. But for now, the important number is PBT, or specifically the package power tracking. To quote AMD, this is the allowed socket power consumption permitted across the voltage rails supplying the socket. Applications with high thread counts and or heavy threads can encounter PPT limits, end quote. So if the manufacturer sets the telemetry reference current value too low, the CPU will think, much like a shunt mod would do, it's consuming less power than it is, bypassing the PPT limit and potentially hitting higher clocks and temperatures than it should. The new line in HWiNFO is Power Reporting Deviation, calculated by dividing the reference value reported by the board by the correct value. As reported by the Stilt, quote, this metric is only valid during a relatively stable, near full load condition. And he also suggests using a reporting interval of 1,000 milliseconds or less in HWiNFO to cope with the, quote, highly advanced and fast power management on Ryzen CPUs. Under these conditions then, again, a reading of 100% is exactly correct. Readings of 95% may indicate, in the Stilt's opinion, intentional fudging of the results by allowing a bit more power than is intended originally. Readings over 100% under load, all of this is under full load, would indicate that the CPU is being sort of tricked into thinking it's drawing more power than reality, and therefore this instance is rare. Note that a single core load, as an example, is not reliable, neither is idle, and shouldn't be used for checking this percentage number for power deviation. You need to use an all-core load to really do this accurately. So, we did check it for good measure, but just for reference, idle consumption, you might see a number like 270%, or we've seen up to 560%, for example. Neither of these mean that you're drawing 270% or 560% more power than the expected baseline, or that you have a limit that is changed by that percentage against baseline. Instead, a higher value indicates theoretically lower power allowance, but also it doesn't mean that you're drawing that much. So let's just say that you have a lower value, like 50%. This means that you can push more power into the CPU. It doesn't mean that you're going to get a doubling of the power in reality as measured at the EPS 12 volt cables. It just means that that's a distinct possibility, but not that it's happening. So idle and low load scenarios are not sufficient for using this metric in measurement. It's not going to be accurate, or at least not accurate enough, as reported by HWiNFO and The Stilt. We do, however, further suspect that HWiNFO will rework this metric and its naming in the future. If deviation is in fact the word that they want to use to describe this, it would be a lot less confusing for the users to be offset from 0% rather than 100%, which will, and already has, caused confusion based on people thinking that 100% means it's a doubling of what it should be from an assumed baseline of 0%. So it's going to confuse people the way it's represented now. But either way, 100% is actually equal to a 0% deviation from baseline. That's something you need to know as we get into the testing. The Stilt claims that at least 2 motherboard manufacturers are deviating as low as 50%, meaning that their software CPU package power reading in HWiNFO has potential to be half of reality. You might see 60 watts instead of 120 if measured properly. As far as we can tell, the correct values are tested and calibrated per motherboard model and stored in a lookup table by HWiNFO, meaning that the power reporting deviation relies on the accuracy of HWiNFO's internal testing of each individual motherboard model. To be clear, power reporting deviation is a metric invented, calculated, and named by HWiNFO, not pulled from the board. At least that's our understanding of it right now. We've spoken with board manufacturers and they said this isn't a value they've heard of before, so it appears to be a new name coined to describe this real behavior. Here's our first chart, tested on the Gigabyte X570 master motherboard that we use in our CPU reviews. Again, you can ignore the deviation between each of the 4 Cinebench R20 benchmark passes because the number is only valid when it's under full load. At 100% CPU utilization during runs of Cinebench R20, the reported power deviation percent dropped as low as 94%. Underreporting amperage by 6% isn't ideal, but in the Stilt's own piece, he found that the MSI X570 Godlike underreported by 7.14% and described it as a, quote, minor infraction that, quote, deserves the benefit of a doubt. In any case, this board isn't one of the major offenders, so Gigabyte may be in the clear. We obviously haven't tested their entire catalog, and we started with one of the most relevant to our reviews, but this one is in the clear. The lines on this chart don't line up perfectly because HWiNFO has difficulty maintaining a constant logging interval under heavy all-core loads, even if you set it to 1,000 milliseconds. So without adjusting process priority or without tweaking the charts, each of the lines ends up about like this. The 4 blue peaks corresponds to each of the 4 red peaks. By measuring current at the EPS 12 volt connection and multiplying it by the power supply voltage, or simply 12 here, we can get an accurate measurement of package power and compare it against the number reported in HWiNFO. There's one point where we do have some losses in the measurement, and that's the VRM efficiency, because we're between the CPU and the wall, but that does have a VRM next to that. So across 4 passes, the actual CPU power started at 150 watts and dropped to 147.6, while the software reported CPU power starting at 145.5 watts and remaining constant. At worst, that comes to a deviation of 97%, better than the percentage reported by HWiNFO, but fairly close. Theoretically, the reported versus actual wattage percent should be directly equal to power deviation percent, but again, there are other losses and other variables that complicate matters, such as post-cable, pre-CPU, VRM efficiency losses, and also instrumentation losses. It should be easier to see the correlation with a board that breaks the rules more heavy-handedly. Average score for these Cinebench R20 multi-threaded runs was 7110.5, but that was with HWiNFO active, mind you, so it's not comparable to a strict R20 only run. There's a chance that the X570 Master is cheating a little bit, but it's close enough to correct that we can still use it as a baseline for performance and boost behavior as measured against the next few boards. We tested ASRock's X570 Taichi twice. First with the reviewer BIOS that it originally shipped with, P1.20, and then again with the latest publicly available BIOS. With the original BIOS, power reporting deviation hit a spectacularly low 31 to 32% under load. This is worse than the worst numbers reported by the Stilt. So we've done it. We've found something distinctly and uniquely bad, and it happens to be on a reviewer BIOS that the Stilt may not have had access to. Note that we actually never even took this motherboard out of the box, sorry ASRock, so it was still strapped in, and it was literally exactly in the same state that it was sent to us at the launch of the 3900X last year. But we never used it because we trusted the X570 Master more. Trust well placed, it seems. For ASRock's externally measured power consumption for the CPU across 4 passes of Cinebench R20 multi-threaded, we started at about 180 watts or 181 watts at the beginning of each pass, and then settled to about 170 to 171 watts by the end. Meanwhile, the numbers reported by HWiNFO started at 61 to 62 watts and dropped to 59 to 60 watts by the end. This comes out to a deviation of about 33 to 35%, again, a little better than the HWiNFO number, but close. Hopefully a reviewer would realize that the 3900X does not, in fact, run at 60 watts under load, but we're beginning to understand why the Stilt was so frustrated. Outside of the seasoned reviewer community, non-reviewer users might end up posting these results online and causing confusion. despite the numbers being clearly inaccurate to a veteran hardware tester. That's not going to be the case for a new user. Also note that power consumption is affected by the auto V-core applied by the board, and that this will be variable board to board and have a tertiary impact on results that we're not controlling for today. To drive the point home, here's the percentage of the CPU's PBT limit that the 3900X thinks it's running at under the old BIOS version versus the new one. All the normally behaved tests we did for this piece showed the CPU at or near 100% of the PBT limit, and that's what ASRock's version 3.0 BIOS shows as well, while the older review BIOS has the board telling the CPU that it's only using half of its PBT budget. Although the reported power numbers are hugely inaccurate and the power draw for the Taichi is a good bit higher than the Masters, the difference in performance between the two boards is minor in average all-core frequency. That said, the Taichi and its old BIOS boost to a significantly higher peak of 4180 MHz at least one point. Max single-core boost clocks with the 3900X installed in the X570 Master under all-core load was 4025 MHz with spikes to 4050, while the Taichi's was 4050 MHz average. That's only the maximum clocks. Average core clock under load for the Master fluctuated around 4020 versus around 4045 for the Taichi. Average Cinebench score for the Taichi with the old BIOS was actually slightly lower than the Masters with the newest BIOS at 7108.3 versus 7110.5. First of all, this is 100% within variance. Cinebench has huge variance, and this is part of it, so there's no real difference here. But also, a large part of the reason for the Taichi's lower than expected performance is because it's from launch day BIOS. So older microcodes in place, all the Ryzen optimization implementations had not been added yet to this version. We'll see this boost with newer BIOSes, and we'll look at that soon, but we don't doubt that abusing power number variables can have an effect on performance, but the more significant impacts we've observed are inaccurate power numbers in software and boost clocks that don't necessarily reflect the stock behavior of the CPU. Updating the Taichi to the latest publicly available BIOS, version 3.0, changed behavior dramatically. Power deviation percentage stayed above 95% for the most part under load, even better than the Master. Physically measuring the power draw under load showed a near constant power consumption of 156 watts, while the number reported by software rose from approximately 137 watts to 138 watts over the course of each pass. 138 is 88.5% of 156, which isn't quite the 95% we'd expect based on the power deviation percentage, especially given that this is the first test where we've seen a worse number calculated from physical measurements than from software. The power deviation percentage is a brand new beta feature, so perhaps there are some kinks to work out, but we're more suspicious of ASRock here than anything else. There are a couple of ways to view the behavior we've seen from the Taichi. On the one hand, ASRock has clearly patched its BIOS since this time to correct the issue. On the other, they mailed us a motherboard to be reviewed with a BIOS version that lies about power consumption. Their BIOS support page also has a giant red caution sign with a subheading, "We do not recommend users to update the BIOS if their system is already running normally." We can't know whether this was intentional, but MSI has gotten in trouble for this sort of thing in the past, shipping review or early model GPUs that clocked higher than the main line. It's a way of slightly improving first impressions and then returning to stability and reducing your RMAs by giving the customer something worse than was reviewed. We dislike this for the same reasons we dislike MCE. It might not be officially breaking the rules, but it's not a fair way to represent a product, especially if you're going to change it as soon as the reviewers are done with it. We weren't expecting MSI's Tomahawk to have any problems, given that the Stilt used an MSI Godlike as his example for a board with the mostly correct settings. It's unlikely that MSI is one of the two blatant rule breakers that he alludes to, and obviously ASRock is at least half of those. HWiNFO's power reporting deviation statistic was 99% or better under load, and as seen in the chart on the screen, the real-life power draw of the Tomahawk is accordingly close to the software reported number. HWiNFO's number was actually higher than ours for once, at about 145.5 watts under load, while the logged 143 to 144 watts externally was the result via the 12-volt cables. Kudos to MSI for reporting the most accurate numbers thus far. The ASUS Crosshair 7 Hero was a little looser with its numbers, hitting approximately 94% deviation during the Cinebench test runs. We saw an extremely constant software-reported package power of 145.2 watts, with an even more constant externally measured value of 153.6 watts. The lack of variance here may be down to different boosting behavior on the older X470 platform, and this is the widest gap between software and hardware reported numbers for CPU package power that we've seen yet. but it's still an accident or minor tweak territory. So that's all the testing data then. One point that we're working on fully confirming is the Stilt's claim that, quote, despite that this exploit is essentially made possible by something AMD included in the specification, the use of this exploit is not something AMD condones, let alone promotes, he says. Further saying, instead, they have rather actively put pressure on motherboard manufacturers who have been caught using this exploit. Now, we can at least confirm that AMD provides documentation to the motherboard manufacturers on how to calculate a, quote, gain factor and stresses its importance, and we've acquired such documentation as well. Here's a quote from AMD's documentation, which we can't share the document, but we can share some info from it. Quote, in some cases, AMD may use this information to enable power management features. Therefore, it is critical that this information be correct on all AMD-based platforms. Later in that paragraph, it says, quote, in order to effectively utilize current telemetry data, it is necessary that the full-scale current value be validated by the platform designer. And it is also true that the motherboard manufacturer is responsible for putting the correct reference multiplier on the board. Quote, again, using the full-scale current, a gain factor can be calculated. This value can be programmed into the system BIOS by the firmware designer. End quote. There are step-by-step instructions for calculating the full-scale current and the correct gain based on it. So in short, there's really no excuse for intentionally screwing up a number. The formula is full-scale current in amps equals TDC times 255 divided by the value in TDC. The gain equals full-scale current in amps divided by 255. In some ways, this is a big deal, and in some ways, it's really not. It just depends on what angle we're talking about. It's easy to miss a really key, important point here, which is that screwing with the power reporting does not inherently mean that the CPU is actually drawing more power. So it probably will to some degree, but not to the degree that we're seeing in the charts we've shown you, like the ASRock instance where you see a 32% number, but it's not correlatory to the actual power consumption that we're measuring. It is higher, but it's not that crazy. This is where we disagree with the Tom's Hardware piece on meaningful long-term damage, and it's messing with the reported CPU power. It should have the same end result as basically raising PPT, enabling PBO, and we've been unimpressed with the effects of PBO in the past already. So there are plenty of other limits to keep the CPU in check. We explore them in that previous piece, and 50% power reporting deviation does not, again, mean that the CPU's power consumption is instantly doubled versus stock. It just doesn't work that way. Messing with the reported CPU power does, though, mean that the PBT and package power metrics reported in software are potentially very inaccurate. Hence our disclaimer earlier about taking physical power measurements the way we've always done it. So many years ago we did it at the wall, that's fine. Now we do it at the EPS 12-volt cables, and that's fine as well. And all this, the way we test, is because even when the manufacturers aren't actively lying and intentionally lying, the accuracy of the power metric in software still relies on their valid testing, or at least honesty to some degree. The Stilt's conclusion is that the distinction between this whole mess and PBO is that PBO is manually enabled by the users. It's a user-controlled action, whereas the telemetry reference current is defined secretly and without user control, except for on some MSI boards. One quote from the Stilt's piece that was absolutely blown way out of proportion by an increasingly notorious Tom's Hardware article is, quote, it also makes the CPU to run hotter and potentially negatively affects its lifespan. That's what the Stilt said. And that was in his original post. This is a single speculative sentence used to emphasize what the Stilt sees as a dishonest practice by motherboard manufacturers. We've used extremely similar language discussing MCE, and we do agree with that sort of one sentence, almost throwaway line that the Stilt made. Based on this, though, Tom's Hardware ran the headline, quote, Ryzen burnout. AMD board power cheats may shorten CPU lifespan, with the leading line, quote, unbeknownst to you, your motherboard may be silently killing your Ryzen processor faster than expected. While technically true, electromigration is a minimal risk with CPUs, and none of this is really meaningful. Further, we've kind of already voiced how we feel about question marks and headlines, period. It's not something that I personally allow at our organization, except for when it's literally a question asked by the audience, i.e. Ask GN. So, I mean, a question mark in that headline is just designed to remove the responsibility from yourself and put it on either the audience or someone else. And then you're saying, hey, I didn't say that the CPUs are going to burn out. I was just asking if maybe they will. I didn't say that this is the worst product ever. I said, is this the worst product ever? Normally the answer to that, by the way, is no. But anyway, the thing here is that the CPUs in question are unlikely to run far beyond their correct values anyway, their stock limits, and more on that in a moment. The Tom's Hardware sister site, actually, AnandTech, published its own article, a rebuttal that addresses the Ryzen burnout topic. And further, an AMD contact we spoke with off record expressed the opinion that, quote, overall, AMD is so conservative on lifetime that it won't ever bring electromigration into play, even with PBO enabled. And our contact further speculated that the absolute worst case scenario would be in 3+ years, you might have a 25 megahertz hit to your performance at sort of the infrequent intervals, like 1 millisecond every now and then. So if you're talking 25 megahertz, maybe after several years of constant uptime and use, at that point, it's debatable whether a real user could even measure it anyway. You need to be in a lab environment, especially at that frequency. So Ryzen's boost clocks are already so touchy and variable that this would be difficult to detect. You're more likely to have a change from permeation in your loop than you are from electromigration here. You're more likely to have a change from your room ambient temperature going up a little bit. You're more likely to have a change from moving across the country and how your CPU performs. So the best A/B comparisons for power consumption that we have with the X570 Taichi before and after BIOS update are the ones that really show the potential gravity of this issue. The old BIOS and the fudged power numbers ran our 3900X at about 180 watts under load. And with the BIOS update and the closer to correct behavior, the number was something more along the lines of 156 watts. So that has significant implications for thermals. But that's mostly where the issue stops. This is especially in the context of a CPU review where when you're looking at thermals, what you're really doing, you're saying, here's kind of a reasonable cooler to select. And if you're testing on a board at 156 watts versus 180, that is a potential cooler change. You might be upgrading your recommendation as a reviewer, and that's what matters the most. So it's not really dangerous, and it's not going to fry a CPU. It's not even going to meaningfully degrade it within the usable lifespan of the system, which is a critical point. But it will make you potentially run your fans at a louder RPM, and there's a human factors impact there more so than an electrical impact. You might buy a better cooler. There's a financial impact there than an electrical impact or a lifespan impact of the CPU. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped you. We turned this all around in a day, so the testing data is pretty scarce, but we're happy with the results we have so far. Obviously, there are dozens of motherboards out there, if not nearing or over 100. We're not going to test them all, but if you have something specific you want us to look at related to this topic, leave it below. We'll try and find time to do it. But this is going to be an overtime day for everyone involved. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support this type of content specifically. This is the type of research content that we try to turn around as quickly as we can. And the mouse mats, the mod mats, or the shirts are a great way to support it. Or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.